Um, man, Game Informer. I mean, like you said, that's a name that goes back to my earliest days in games, and picking up a copy at GameStop or probably Kmart or wherever. I kind of feel the same way as in the 2000s, whenever Saturday morning cartoons went away. That's
Yeah.
kind of how I feel about Game Informer, where it's kind of feels like the end of an era. It's not something that we'll get back, and especially having paper magazines is something kind of magical.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Sandbox.Space weekly podcast. I'm your host, Chris, joined as always by Baby Girl, Pumpkin, who is somewhere over there. And of course, every week we bring you a special guest. This week's guest is Jarryd Huntley, a longtime friend and game developer. Jarryd, how are you doing today?
Good. How about yourself, Chris?
Good. I am super excited to have you on the show. We've done this show. This is episode 33. So we've had 30-ish, 27, 28 different guests. You're by far the best. The rest are garbage. So we're here. I'm excited. Now, I have been wanting to have you on this show because I started this show. I don't know if you remember, but we had the Sandbox incubator in Columbus before COVID. And then we ended up shutting it down when we all, shut down our offices and stuff. And so you're hearing echoing, Yua? I'm not hearing any echoing, so we'll just pretend that we're all good. Yeah, make sure you don't have two tabs open at the same time. But anyway, so we decided to start the Sandbox back up kind of virtually, and we've been doing this weekly talk. And I wanted to create a show that's specifically talking about the games industry and sort of the more professional side of it. And so you have been in the industry a long time. You've been involved in a lot of different projects. Why don't you give the audience just maybe a quick little rundown about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. So like Chris said, I'm Jarryd Huntley. I'm based here in Cleveland, Ohio. If I needed to put a number on how long I've been in the game industry, there's probably like three different answers. It could be like 5 years or 8 years or like 9.5 years. So we'll take the average and say like 7 or 8 years, something like that. Um, I originally started my career in IT up here in Cleveland, and I did game development on the side. Eventually, I had the opportunity to go to GDC, and that's when I made the decision, like, actually, I want to work on games. And it took me a while to transition from working from in IT to working in games, but I've never looked back. So I've had the opportunity to work on some indie games, some Switch games. Released a solo game called Art Club Challenge that was on the App Store, and actually won an award at GDEX one year. And had the chance to be shown at the Smithsonian in a showcase there. I had the chance to write a book called Game Programming for Artists, which was a really cool project to work on. And over the years, we've heard from a number of people who have read the book, or the book was part of their college program, and so that's been always awesome to see. And then a couple years ago, I had the chance to work on We Are OFK, which was a large indie game based around a band called OFK, and it was episodic. It was on Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, or I should say, it is on. Um, and we won an Indiecade Audio Award, and this year we just won a Peabody Award for OFK, which I'm still just mind blown about. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up because I'll throw an article in our weekly email list for all of our members. But that's super exciting, man. Like that's big time. That's big boy awards right there. Like that must have been thrilling.
Yeah, when Teddy's the director on the game, when they texted me and said that we got nominated for a Peabody, I was at one of our local Cleveland game devs meetup, and I got the text, and I was sitting at a table with some people, and I just yelled, "What?" And everybody was like, And I couldn't talk about it at the time, but I didn't even realize that games were eligible for Peabodys. It's only
Sure.
been, I think this is only the second or third year.
That's amazing. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think that just from a larger sort of thing, I think you and I share this sense that video games are an important artistic medium, and probably don't get the recognition they deserve. We get a lot of street cred, but I think in the larger scheme of things, we don't. And so I think whenever we get an opportunity to kind of punch above our weight, as it were, that's really exciting. So yeah, congratulations, man. That's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yep. So proud of the team and, what we were able to produce.
Sweet. Well, good to have you on the show. Before we get too far into things, I do want to remind people, if I can get my showcase here, that the Sandbox.Space is our professional game development community. So feel free to come on there. Currently, you can sign up for our newsletter, where we will release an email every week with both this podcast as well as the articles that we talk about today. And then we got some other exciting things in the works that we have not announced yet, but we are working on it. So I would suggest that you take a look at that if you are interested, and you should be, I guess, if you're watching this show. And then, of course, let me pull up GDEX. So we are in our final 3 months here of GDEX. And so we still are looking for people wanting to speak and sponsor, as well as exhibit. So you can see there's a bunch of information down here. We just posted some cool speaker information, as well as some exciting updates for our tournament area. And so next week on Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, so that will be the 24th. I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't, because it's been a long week. The 14th. So August 14th, 5 p.m. on, you can go to thegdex.com, or you can go to the twitch.tv/thegdex. We will be hosting our first live kind of community reach out. So I would encourage you all to come to that. Jarryd has been a great supporter of GDEX over the years. I appreciate that. So just a little housekeeping. All right, you ready to dig into some stuff, Jarryd? There's actually a pretty interesting week to be involved in the games industry. So I'm going to start off with everybody's favorite topic of the past probably 6 months: layoffs. So Bungie has been hit with layoffs and massive restructuring despite the success of Destiny 2. This is an article from Kotaku by Ethan Gach. Bungie is about to undergo major changes. The Destiny 2 maker is laying off hundreds more employees, integrating more deeply with its parent company, Sony. It's spinning off one of its in-development games into a separate PlayStation studio. CEO Pete Parsons called it a difficult and painful day for the team. As noted and was mentioned in the article, they were just bought by Sony not too long ago. So, Jarryd, we have been in a very challenging time here. The games industry is not the only industry that's been seeing layoffs, but it definitely seems to be pretty painful in our space. So what are your thoughts on sort of the current state of employment in the industry, and how are things looking in your community? And then I got a whole host of other questions to ask you, but we'll start there.
Yeah, I mean, it's rough. Like just putting it straight up, it's rough out there. In some ways, I think this is related, inversely to COVID. When COVID hit, a number of industries shut down. The hospitality industry completely shut down. Um, In-person, events, pretty much anything that had to do with a physical location, and even movies for a large time were shut down. But games were one of the things that were barely affected at all. Everybody, went to work remote. And games actually saw a huge boom during COVID. A lot of people started playing games. A lot of games got, additional funding that they wouldn't have. And, I think a number of companies expanded and kind of rode that wave. And in some ways, I think this is, those companies that were a little bit overambitious and hired, maybe too much, or made, large plans, are needing to scale back. But then there's also been a lot of industry consolidation, a lot of, mega publishers just snatching up studios here and there, a lot of, funding deals that were backed by other funding deals that may or may not have gone through yet. And
Sure.
um, yeah, so it's rough out there. I hope that, like, every time I hope, the last time I hear a about some layoffs or a studio closing, I hope that it's kind of the end, but it's it's still going.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. I think a lot of this, we've talked about this over the past few months. I think a lot of this does have to do with some of the consolidation, and then there's redundancy whenever you do consolidation. I think also we've talked about Embracer Group a lot, which has got this terrible reputation because I think they're probably terribly running their companies. Um, and I think a lot of companies just when interest rates were super super low, you could get cheap slash free money and just go out and acquire things. And then when interest rates went up and maybe sales didn't hit where they wanted to, you had to sort of slash and burn. The cynical side of me too is also a little bit like, we've been seeing, I know this year, supposedly, we're not done with the year yet, but supposedly this year, we're seeing a little bit of reduction in video game sales globally. So, okay. But that's also coming off, to your point, 2020 and 2021. I mean, were exceptional sales for video games. And I had 22 and 23 were pretty good. So it's kind of like you're riding high for a few years, and then all of a sudden you have a month or two of scary times, and you're like, oh, we got to slam on the brakes and start kicking people out the door. I think it's unfortunate. My non cynical side of me does look at the opportunities maybe that could potentially be presented to the more indie side or the smaller to mid-sized studios. And so as somebody who runs, GDEX, runs a gaming community, I just started, I've mentioned before, but I'm helping to run Shawnee State's gaming accelerator, levelupaccelerator.co, if you want to check that out. So I have always sort of been knee deep, waist deep, whatever amount of deep in the indie space. And I that's the community and industry I've been trying to build here in Ohio. So part of this could be an exciting opportunity to maybe get some of our homegrown talent back into the region who were maybe out in New York and California, and maybe they can bring what they've learned, they can bring their contacts and their expertise. But I don't know. I mean, is that just wishful thinking on my part? Like, are there some positives, some silver linings somewhere?
I mean, I hope so. And I mean, this is just, anecdotal, but, at least in the Cleveland game devs, we have had a number of members join, I would say, over the past year and a half, where, they've either moved back into the region or they're newly moving into the region. Maybe they're moving by, family or a partner, but we seem to have just kind of this organic growth of just kind of new people coming in. I don't know if it's related to kind of larger trends, but I would hope so. The other thing that I hope, comes out of this is maybe the rebirth of like double A and single A studios, or triple I, or however people call them.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
Is um, we all know triple A studios, and their budgets in hundreds and multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, and games that take
Well,
5 years and
and then we had, what was
2,000
it?
people.
Sea of Thieves was supposed to be what, a quadruple A game. So we got that question mark.
But, I would really love to see that middle space kind of get filled out, because
Sure.
those studios, you know, kind of disappeared for maybe a decade or so. Um, but, games that are maybe in like the $2 to $5 million budget, maybe, 10 to 50 people, and instead of a 200, 500 hour sprawling adventure, maybe it's a 30-hour game that's, short, focused, high quality. um I think there's a lot of opportunity for, people who are either let go from studios, or um you know want to get out of kind of that rat race. um I would love to see that. The other good thing that I have seen happen due to kind of the consolidation and the layoffs is, um, the industry effort for unionization has seemed to really pick up steam. I know I think it was Activision Blizzard inside of Microsoft, recently unionized, and I've heard of a number of
Yeah,
studios.
we talked about Bethesda last week.
Mm,
Did a supposedly a total unionization effort,
or yeah, yeah, that's
which is I think Microsoft, just along that line, they're finding themselves in a hard space because they just made the largest video game acquisition with Activision Blizzard, and then of course Bethesda is under Microsoft Studios. So I think that they would be running afoul of the FTC, presumably, if they were to like really crank down on anti-union activities after making such a large purchase in the region. Yeah. I do want to talk about unions, but I want to jump back to something you said, and just thinking about the smaller sort of studios and getting those up and running, because a big part of what I've been advocating for, and this has been a challenging conversation. I don't know how much you deal with publishers or investors in your day-to-day goings on, but it's challenging. Well, first of all, Ohio, it's challenging just because Ohio and the Midwest really doesn't invest in gaming. It's not. If you think about investments, you can and you can look at Google these results and stuff, but it's always the usual suspects. It's healthcare, insurance, financial tech, fintech, biotech is a big one, manufacturing, obviously, but not a lot in entertainment and video games. So that first part's pretty challenging to do. And then you think about, well, if you're going to carve out even a small team, you said, $5 million, $10 million, $20 million game. I mean, that's still a lot of money for, I don't have $20 million, right? I don't have $1 million sitting around. So it becomes challenging to even find that sort of support for those studios. And one of the things that I keep focusing on with investors and publishers, and when I talk to like city council and state representatives, is like, we should be focusing, in my humble opinion, on creating sustainable businesses that are just, they're not going to get, for those who don't know, like the typical investor thing is like they invest money, they expect you to either IPO, which is you put your company on the stock market, or you sell it to a larger company, like a Microsoft or whatever. But they want that done in like 3 to 5 years, because they want their return back. They don't want to be sitting on their money for a decade. That's not really conducive, though, to building sustainable businesses that are going to stay in your community. And it might be conducive to making a handful of people wealthy, but if you're talking about building these smaller studios, and so that's what I've been advocating as I talk to, Jobs Ohio and others. How can we, want to get down, sweetie? How can we invest our efforts in a way that's going to create those sustainable businesses that may only be 5, 10, 20 people, but they're going to be around for 5 to 10 years? And I'm kind of curious, sort of what your thoughts on that, whether it's the indie sphere or whatever. And maybe that's just a Midwest thing. Maybe it's the Midwest in me. I don't know, but curious your thoughts.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of you kind of hit the nail on the head with $5 million. In the grand scheme of game budgets, that seems like nothing, but that's not something you can just pull out of a hat. It has to come from somewhere. And if you're thinking about traditional game investors, like you mentioned, more traditional, investors, they're looking for an IPO, they're looking, to sell, they're looking to gain a profit. And so if you're talking to traditional investors and you're saying, hey, I want to start a 5-person studio, I want to grow to 15 people, and I want to be sustainable, they're not going to be interested because there's not any gain out of that for them. And so I do think a lot of this funding, for Midwest games has to come from the Midwest. And, a lot of the work you've been doing, and a lot of, other, kind of mid-sized studios, I think are doing a great job in raising awareness, because a lot of people don't know how games are made. But I think a great example of the type of studio you mentioned is Handelabra Games here in Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
I think they've been around more or less around 10 years. And, they started out fairly small, and they, never grew too big, but they've been consistent, and they've been able to hire people and, hire somebody. So they've been able to hire, I think, like 4 or 5 different game devs that were, part of the Cleveland Game Dev group. And so
Nice.
that's a great, model for something that's sustainable, local. They've sponsored events. As their devs work on games, they get more experience. It helps grow kind of the knowledge base in the area. So I would love to see more businesses like that.
Yeah, yeah. Jeremy from Jeremy Handel is great. They were one of the first into the breach when we were doing GDEX and showcasing. And for those first few years, their booth was always one of the more like professional, impressive booths. And yeah, both him and I, because we started 2012, so we're creeping up onto 15 years here at Multivarious. But we were sort of some of the early kids, I guess, into it. But it is challenging to keep that going, and we're kind of in a strange space as far as funding goes, like in the state, where you can't. It's hard to get small amounts of money because, like you said, most people just don't understand how games are made. Like there's a man behind the curtain kind of thing. And then if you're looking for larger amounts of money, you have to go outside, and then you kind of end up a lot of times in this sort of like this donut hole where you're like, oh, I need $5 million. A lot of like VCs, like larger funds, they're not going to waste their time on $5 million. Like it's not worth the paperwork for them to do a $5 million investment. And then you're like, well, okay, well, what about 10? And you're like, oh, that's too much for games, or 20. And we're just constantly caught in this thing. And there's a lot of excitement. We had Ben Cavallo on. I don't know if you've met him before, from Midwest Games. They're in Wisconsin, and they've been looking at fundraising and publishing. And so there's stuff that's starting to happen. And one of the things I think is exciting, and I'm kind of curious on your thoughts. So you're a big GDC guy, and I know I don't think you go every year, but you try to go frequently. One of the things I found that was kind of interesting is at GDC they have all these like regional meetups. It's composed of developers and volunteers, and you've hosted like the Ohio dinners and stuff a few times. But one of the things I always found really interesting is at those regional meetups, I saw, again, a little anecdotally, but outside of California, which is where GDC takes place, the Midwest always seemed to have the most representation. And within that, Ohio always seemed to have the most representation. So it seems like whatever we're doing here, both in the state and the region, we're at least building excitement so that people are wanting to go to that show, wanting to represent Ohio and the Midwest, wanting to connect with other people. And so I always found that pretty exciting, to just have that kind of, it takes a lot to go to California ain't cheap, it takes a lot to go out there. So I'm kind of curious, why do you think Ohio has such a strong sort of representation at something like a GDC?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big factor is, just kind of the state we're in, what we've been talking about in Ohio, where, there's a lot of appetite, there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of talent here, but, we don't have the funding yet. That part hasn't been solved. We don't have, the AAA studio that students can get their, first couple years of experience. We don't have that here. And so, especially before COVID, one of the only options was to travel, to try to find these opportunities, to make these opportunities happen for yourself. And so GDC, one way I like to describe GDC is you can do a, 6 months worth of networking within 2 days at GDC. If you're emailing people and, you're trying to set up Zoom calls and, coordinate with people, it might take months and months and months. But I've had opportunities at GDC where it's like I'll have a conversation, somebody says, oh, you should talk to so and so. They text them and say, hey, meet us at the park, and then you're meeting with so and so. And so I think a lot of people who are really trying to make the next step forward in their career, whether that's getting their first game job, whether that's getting more experience, building networking, opportunities and networking connections. I think a lot of that can happen at GDC just because it's so concentrated. And so, I think there's a number of people in Ohio who are kind of getting to that level and looking at GDC to kind of find the next step in their career.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I also believe, well, two things. I think one is it's a reflection of how good our educational programs are here in Ohio. Um, Again, most people don't think about Ohio. It's a flyover state for a reason or whatever. Um, but there's a lot of really great 2-year associates and 4-year degree granting programs in Ohio. Several of them are like top 10 game dev programs. And so we're producing a lot of like really talented, excited people. And then the other thing that I think is that we have managed to cultivate, and I say we in the truest sense, because there are things like GDEX, there are things like the Cleveland Game Dev Group, the Columbus, Central Ohio Game Dev Group, but we all work together. Like we share resources, we network. If we go to a GDC, we're just like, hey, do you want to go do a dinner with this guy? I'm like, yeah, let's go do a dinner together. Like I had sushi once with like one of Markiplier's guys on a whim. Just you get connected to those things, and that seems like something like, oh yeah, well, I mean, you're all in the same state. Like, aren't you all working together? But like, I guarantee you, like Chicago does not work like this. Like they're very fractured and they don't work together. There's a lot of other states that just do not have this sort of sense of camaraderie and that we're kind of all in it together. And one of the things I know, I worked in the, well, I didn't work in, but I worked with like the movie world a little bit. And man, in like Hollywood and the movie space, you keep your contacts like they're gold. You do not share those for anything, unless it's going to get you something. It's very transactional. And we're not like that in the video game space in general. We're not like that, but definitely in Ohio where it's just like, oh, hey man, I see, so-and-so, would you mind sending me an intro email? And be like, yeah, absolutely. I'll do that for you. And I think that kind of working together, that collaboration is one of the reasons why Ohio has been able to build what we've built thus far. And hopefully, I'm looking positively here. Hopefully, that will be the foundation that will allow us to build an industry here, ultimately. One last thing you mentioned before we go on, you talked about smaller studios, obviously making smaller games. I think. Well, let me ask you before I say what I think. But I'm curious about, we've seen a lot of games come out over the past, I don't know, let's say 5 or 6 years that are really tight, non-multiplayer, 8 to 15 hour experiences that are garnering a lot of attention and are really well regarded. And I'm kind of curious, because those kind of used to be the only types of games there were. And then the world blew up and there's lots of different types of games, but it seems like we cycled back to that. Do you think those types of experiences might be a way, at least give us something to build off of in the short term to allow us to build those smaller indie and to mid-sized studios?
Yeah. Because at least in my experience, because, early in my career, I kind of was in that position I mentioned earlier where, there weren't AAA studios in the area. At that point, nobody was hiring remote. And so to learn just more about the game industry, I just traveled to different cities, just talked to different game developers. And at least in my experience, it seems like there's really two ways to kind of build an industry. Either one is, a AAA studio moves in and just hires a bajillion people, and, it's this kind of machine. People come in, put in their time, they break off as indies and then form smaller indie studios. Or the opposite, where indie studios just kind of, do their grassroots from, the ground up thing, where indie studios are popping up and they continue to grow. Um, and sometimes that can attract in the AAA studios. And I think, our real opportunity is that second one where, indies, you have 10 indie studios. Everyone isn't going to be a success. I mean, I hope they are, but, maybe two are a mild success and three just kind of knock it out of the park. They can expand and hire people. People get more experience. a couple of people from that studio have experience. They've worked on some great games. They break off and make, a two-person studio, and it kind of, can be this, snowball effect. So rather than a large snowball getting bigger, it's just, smaller snowballs kind of, combining.
Yeah, and that's sort of the way we've been doing it. At least, sort of my crux of what's been going on in Ohio, because I do have a concern. This is another thing that Ohio and a lot of Midwest states do. And it has to do with the also politics and stuff, where it's like you want to score that big hit, right? Like the governor or a state senator, they want to be able to be like, I brought in Intel, I brought the Intel plant in, I brought in Activision Blizzard, and they have this big studio, and that's great. But my concern is that if you do that too quickly, as an industry is sprouting up, that studio just sucks up all the oxygen. It's going to take all of the talent. It's going to grab all of the infrastructure. And if that studio is not going to give it back to the community in strong, meaningful, connected ways, I think that's the quickest way to kill an industry, to be honest. Because then if that AAA studio is like, all right, well, we're going to bounce it, we're going to close shop, it's almost like you're starting over again, because that infrastructure, that foundation has not been built over time. So again, I'm curious, am I off on that? What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, the adage, putting all your eggs in one basket, where like, yeah, if it works out, it's great, but if it doesn't work out, it's kind of actually doubly worse.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think putting all your hope and, the success of an entire region or state on one giant studio, I think is probably a bad idea. And with the layoffs that we've been having recently, no studio is safe. Everybody would have thought, oh, Bungie, they're not going to have layoffs. So Naughty Dog, they're not going to have layoffs. But pretty much every AAA studio I can think of has been affected.
Sure.
And so I don't think, a AAA studio would be a stable, foundation if that's the only thing you're counting on. And if it's in combination with, middle-sized studios, studios working with, the colleges or, indies and funding opportunities, I think that's where you kind of have this vibrant and resilient type.
Totally. Which then brings us right back to unionization. So obviously, one company out of a million is not a trend. But there has been a consistent, particularly at GDC. I think there's almost every year there's at least one unionization special interest topic talk about it. So curious, where are you on game unionization? Like, what role do you feel like that's going to play over the next, I don't know, say 10 years? And how do indie studios fit into that scheme? Oop, hold on one second. I think we might have froze here. Oh, are we back moving? Yes, no, maybe so. No movement. All right, give me. I'm gonna restart. I'm gonna restart the stream real quick and see if that. I think we're back. Sorry about that, Jarryd. Are we? Oh, is the video still not working? Here, let me try this. Okay, we're moving. Sorry about that, Jarryd. You were talking about unions and how they were the best thing ever. So there we go. My lord. All right. Sorry about that, man. Round 3.
No worries. But yeah, what I was saying is that even before I was in the industry, I remember, seeing articles about game unionization, and it just never seemed to go anywhere. There'd be some conversation, but never seemed to take a foothold. But over the past, I'd say 5 years, I've really seen unionization actually start to take a foothold, and we're seeing AAA studios have, entire departments, or like you mentioned with Bethesda. And I think that's great, these larger studios being kind of an example of unionization. And these larger studios also have negotiating power. And so the effects that those unions have will kind of hopefully trickle down and kind of set expectations. On the indie side, um, if you're a smaller studio, or if you're an indie, startup, maybe forming a union doesn't necessarily make sense. But what I've seen a number of studios, especially recently, do is start as a co-op model where it's completely owned by all the employees, and everything's kind of shared by all the employees, and decisions and salaries and everything's kind of open. And that's another type of kind of unionization effort where indie studios can set a model for other indie studios, or for AAA as well, to kind of look down and see how other studios are doing it.
Sure. Yeah. Multivarious is sort of like, I mean, we don't refer to ourselves as a co-op, but all of the full-time people have equity ownership in the company. And the way we generally work is that, like, day to day, like, I make all the decisions. I'm the president. I make things up. But anyone who has ownership has the ability to initiate a call to vote if we really need to on something. Most of the time, we can just sit in a room and chat about it, and we don't need to like go that far, right? We just get to a point. But it is written in our articles of incorporation that a member can do a call to vote, where then people would vote based on their ownership shares. But just as sort of like a day-to-day operation, my job is to keep the business moving and to find opportunities. Tom, is our lead. His job is to work on development and build projects. Katie does design. Wes helps with community reach outs and GDEX and things like that. So we all kind of have our roles. But yeah, I agree. I think, I don't know if, well, let me take a step back. Unions to me are like, they're a reflection that the industry is not able to sort of self-regulate, like it's one of those things where it's like, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need unions. In a perfect world, we wouldn't need police, but like, we're not in a perfect world, and we're all a bunch of weirdos, and we're all just trying to make our way through the world. And then once you start inserting power dynamics and stuff, things become problematic. And you sort of, what's I've noticed really interesting. So on the board game side, I have a board game design company. It is like a publisher's world right now in board games. There are so many people who have board games, that have designed them, that want to get them published. Publishers have their pick of the litter. They pretty much make all the terms on everything. And it's really challenging. And I think the games industry is like that. Not so much that publishers, although they do a little bit for sure, but more in the sense of like, most game developers want to make games because they love games. Most of us tend to be kind of like on the introverted side. We just want to go in and be creative, and we don't want to like fight against, employers. We don't want to fight for our rights. We just want to be like, can I just come into work and have you guys not treat me like garbage? Would that be cool? And so I think it's created this system over the long term where you just have so many people that are excited to be there and feel lucky to be there, that it's easy to take advantage of people in that kind of situation. And then you combine that with the fact that game design is just inherently not easy. We're always at the cutting edge of technology. Something is always broken, and that you have to figure it out. And so we're constantly, redefining the wheel on everything. And then the third thing too is, I think our expectations as gamers have just gotten so inflated about, like, just trying to meet a gamer's expectation nowadays is really, really hard. And I'm gonna bring this up. I don't want anybody to, like, if you know who this is or whatever, don't poke fun at it. I'm not going to say the person. But there was a comment on one of our GDEX posts a little while ago. And they were like, oh, finally, there's a reason to come to GDEX. And I was just like, what the fuck does that mean? And it was like, I went there once, and it was all just like no innovation or creativity. It was all just copy and paste. And I'm like, first of all, I think you're coming at this with a particular bias because of this other interaction that we had around that time. But I was just like, these people are like pouring their heart and souls into these projects, and like a lot of them have never made a game or maybe made a couple of games before, and so it's a learning experience for them too. And like, my guess is you've never made a game in your damn life, right? You've probably sat around and you have the answer to everything, but you've actually never ever made anything. And there's a big difference, you know, like Morpheus says in The Matrix, there's a big difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And so I think that that's also an unfortunate reality of kind of where we are, is that the expectations that gamers have for games is just through the roof these days. And maybe we need, as an industry, maybe we do need to do a little bit of a scale back and be like, okay, we're going to reset here, because we cannot be dumping 200, 300, 400 million dollars into every project we make. It's just not sustainable. Any last thoughts on that before I jump into this next article here?
Yeah. You know, early on, we had the conversation on kind of, you know, double A and single A studios. I think, you know, those could be a good solution in setting expectations, because I do agree that expectations are kind of through the roof. I think another thing is just developers being straight up honest. Larian, who released
Sure.
Baldur's Gate 3, which was one of the biggest games of all time, absolutely incredible. After they finished that, they said, "Hey, you know, our next game isn't going to be as big as Baldur's Gate," just to set expectations out of the gate.
Sure.
And I think that's a really healthy way of approaching it.
And they also
Because
built in the community into the process, because that game was on like early access for like 2 years, so they were receiving feedback the whole time. We talked maybe like in one of our first episodes, we talked about how they did a complete UI refresh. Like they rebuilt their entire UI based on community feedback from one of those early access builds. Like, name me another company with a game that large that rebuilds their entire user interface. Like, it just does not happen. But you were saying you had another thought there?
Yeah, and I think the other kind of, you know, potential solution, you know, you mentioned the issue of, you know, people being passionate in games, people being thankful to be here. And unfortunately, I think that passion can be exploited. And I think if we lived in, you know, a perfect world where games were only made by people and games were funded by people who made games, the industry would be a lot better. But one thing that I have seen recently is some very successful, you know, indies or studios opening up grants or, you know, funding opportunities. Inner Sloth just announced Outer
Mm-hmm.
Sloth, which is their funding arm. I have, you know, some friends who have, you know, worked on some games and had success and opened up grant opportunities or funding opportunities, mentorship opportunities. I think that's another way of, you know, game developers helping game developers, and kind of, you know, the tide rises all ships.
Yeah, absolutely. That Outer Sloth article is actually going to be in this week's Sandbox.Space weekly email, so sign up. No, I agree. And one of the things I've said for a long time, since I've been doing this for over a decade, is I think you can really tell the strength of your community by what happens when someone hits a success. If they give back to the community, if they do things like open up grants or internship opportunities, or even come and like talk at GDEX or something, like that way of kind of giving back shows how the community is well regarded. I want to jump to this article because I think this is kind of a big deal, and we're getting a little tight on time here, although I'm greatly enjoying the conversation. But let's grab, hopefully this works as well, since everything broke. Yep. So this is on Kotaku, but GameStop shuts down Game Informer, the longest running gaming magazine in the U.S. Game Informer, the longest running magazine in the U.S., is officially dead. Began publishing in 1991, has been one of the last remaining physical game magazines in the world, which covers stories and continues to share deep dives. This is from Kotaku, and this is Ethan Gach, which is also in combination with, so here's the article. Also in combination, though, with the big IGN article a couple of weeks ago, So gaming news and publications are going through what seems to be a pretty big upheaval at the moment, which obviously has a direct impact on us as developers because that's how people find out about you in a lot of ways. Like that's the discoverability aspect that a magazine like an IGN or a Game Informer or Polygon or Kotaku or whatever can give to you cannot be overstated. And obviously, Game Informer has been such a important part of our gaming ecosystem. So I'm curious, sort of your thoughts on not only Game Informer but the sort of state of our gaming journalism as it is today. So I expect you to solve this problem and then get back to me.
All right. Man, Game Informer. I mean, like you said, that's a name that goes back to my earliest days in games, and picking up a copy at GameStop or probably Kmart or wherever. I kind of feel the same way as in the 2000s, whenever Saturday morning cartoons went away. That's
Yeah,
kind of how I feel about Game Informer, where it's kind of feels like the end of an era. It's not something that we'll get back, and especially having paper magazines is something kind of magical. I've had a few games that have been in print magazines, and I've bought multiple copies, and it's just
sure.
amazing to open it and see your game there. Um,
You want
but
you want to know something kind of cool?
mhm.
We were in Columbus. Did this thing. It was two books, like pretty thick books. There was a black one and a white one. And I forget. I think the black one was like the creativity, and the white one was something else. But anyway, it was like the two parts of Columbus or whatever, right? And there was a 3-page article about multivarious and the games industry in one of those books. It was really cool. And we went to an event where we had some of our colleagues from another game studio, a AAA game studio we were working with. We brought them to a place here in Columbus, and they had those two books sitting on a shelf. And I was like, wait a second. And I grabbed it and I looked at it, and I was able to show these international developers who had come into town to work with us on a project the article of us from 5 years ago or whatever. And it was a really cool experience to have. I could have pulled it up on Google or whatever, but to have it in a book that was in a totally random place, like I did not expect this to be there, was just a really awesome experience. And when you win awards and stuff, and you can print it and hang it on your wall, or just keep it for yourself, for your collection, it is something special. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, short sidebar on that. As game developers, the everything we create is digital. And so whenever we get to hold something that's a physical artifact from our game, a disc copy or some type of merch or a magazine, a book, an article, I think it's kind of almost extra special because so much of what we create is just, bits and bytes.
Absolutely. I mean, 90%, this is a GDEX t-shirt I'm wearing. I'm wearing my GDEX pajama. Like 90% of my wardrobe is GDEX stuff, and multivariate stuff, because yeah, you just don't get that. You don't get the physicality in this industry. And that's going more and more with as digital sales increase. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm probably 70% digital, 30% physical when I buy games these days. And it's been inching up over time. And I'm kind of one of those last holdouts. I still like having the physical versions.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
so, games journalism, it's, I don't know how to say this. I got a lot of friends in the games journalist space. But it kind of feels a little bit like games journalism is maybe going through a delayed version of what quote unquote normal journalism, political journalism has been going through for a while, where your regional news publications are drying up. They're being consolidated into a few major, publishers. And that makes it really, really hard because, like it or not, the media does inform what you think about. There used to be an old saying in journalism, which is that the journalists, the news can't tell you what to think, but it can tell you what to think about. I think with social media, I think it maybe can tell you what to think, and that's becoming problematic. But the larger fact remains, it's really hard for small studios, regional studios, events like GDEX, for example. I mean, we're a national event. We pull in people from 33 states last year, I believe. But trying to get an IGN or a Kotaku or a Polygon to cover GDEX is just really, really hard, because they know it's not going to get the clicks kind of a global article about GTA 6 is going to get, right? And so they just don't spend their time on it. So I'm curious, maybe as our final thoughts sort of wrap up here, what role do you see games journalism having in the future of our industry as it begins to sort of make this shift? Is there still a place for the smaller stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, games journalism and games, we're kind of synergistic energies where we need each other. And I think, a lot of the kind of practices and the ways that games journalists, journalism outlets have been kind of set up over the past, couple years with recent changes and how they approach things wasn't necessarily sustainable. And I think we're kind of seeing the effects of that. And almost kind of like where we were seeing with games where, there was the consolidation and, the focus on profits by those kind of parent companies, with it not being sustainable and them not continuing to grow over year. They've just cut back, or, the investors decided, oh, this isn't making as much money. But I hope, I have seen, a number of these games journalists when, an outlet shuts down or, people are let go, kind of forming their own thing, whether that's their own website or their own outlet or podcast. I'm hoping that becomes a more sustainable way of setting things up, where the games journalists can run their weekly podcast, and the fans can support them directly, and there's not all these layers in between. And it kind of creates a more sustainable model that is kind of maybe a little bit smaller and not the large game publish or game journalism outlets that we've seen in the past, but that it allows these game journalists to cover the stories that they like and be supported in doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a positive note to end on. I think it's an industry that's trying to find its new legs, just like a lot of industries are in sort of the new digital world. And I hope it's able to find one in a respectable manner, I guess. Also, I don't know if you can hear, I'll be quiet. Baby's been snoring for the past couple of minutes. I don't know if you can hear.
No.
Oh, there she goes. But Jarryd, I think our time together is at an end here, but I really want to thank you for being a part of the show. It was a great conversation. I probably could have talked to you for another hour about a lot of this. We only got to 2 of the 5 articles, but that's all good because it's been such a great conversation. Before we wrap up, if anybody wanted to learn more about you or get a hold of you, where can they find you at?
Yeah, so I'm at Jarryd Huntley, Jarryd Huntley on pretty much all social networks, so Instagram and Twitter. And then the studio I work at, Owlchemy Labs, Owlchemylabs.com. Stay tuned there. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jarryd, thank you. It has been a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. Hope to have you back on the show again. This has been episode 33 of the Sandbox.Space weekly podcast. Again, I am your host, Chris. Baby is right here, snoring away. But make sure to join us every week. We do our podcast, our video podcast, Wednesdays, 10 a.m. Eastern on Twitch. It's twitch.tv/the GDEX. Of course, you can join the community at The Sandbox. Don't forget the Sandbox.Space. And please look at the GDEX website. We're getting really excited. We got a lot of exciting things. If you can join us Wednesday the 14th at 5 p.m. Also on the GDEX Twitch. It'll be a really exciting conversation. But otherwise, we really appreciate you all being here. Jarryd, thanks so much for being on the show. And we will see you.
Thanks for having me.
We will see you next week.